So for my
You've learned.
birthday yesterday, my wife bought me this.
What did you get?
Giant one for like 3/4 the size of that one.
Wow.
It's huge.
What was the scavenger hunt food to it?
It was, forget the clue. She had me out on West Pomfret Street and then she had me all over town.
All over.
Yeah. Yeah.
I used to put by
Pretty,
I like it.
that was t-shirt.
All right. I noticed the new water bottle.
You ready?
Yeah.
All right, so we've got the Dave Hooke, the Maggie Landis, and the Amy Turnbaugh here today. And they're gonna share with us the art of negotiating. So question number one. What strategies do you use to ensure that negotiations result in a win-win situation for both buyers and sellers, rather than one party feeling disadvantaged? Because there's only 3 of you. Feel like you got an answer, just speak. We'll be adults and take turns.
So I think it's important to know and understand the PAR forms, like it's really good to kind of have that basis of what the business is about, right? You know, and there's no shame in not knowing, but if you don't know, get with people, and there's lots of people to get with, to practice them and to really understand the forms, so that when you're in a relationship with somebody on the other side, you can speak knowledgeably about what you're about the
As
transaction.
opposed to feeling like inadequate and.
Or you have no
emotion.
idea what they're saying to you, or like, what does that mean, or, you know,
Yeah.
why are they saying that?
Knowing the forms gives you confidence
Mhm.
on that.
I think there's a really good website called parealtor.org, if you all haven't heard of it, but it's a great website you can go to. It has literally every PAR form, and it usually has a guide to how to complete it, what it means. So I think that's a really good reference. I think that when you are in negotiation and then you're involving both sides of a transaction, always, always, always bring it back to the contract. And I think it will, as long as you can speak confidently to it. In my opinion, it is when you can neutralize and speak to facts. It's a lot easier to find a path forward that could potentially work for both sides when you're talking to a contract. That's facts. It's not emotion, it's facts. So that's, yeah, I see that.
Can you give an example of that? Can you give an example of what you're talking about?
Okay, so, okay, a buyer wants to terminate because they couldn't get a mortgage. So if you understand the contract, you can understand that they can't. That's not an allowable action due to a mortgage contingency. It's not written in the agreement of sale that a buyer can terminate. The seller can terminate because they can't fulfill, but in that mortgage contingency, a buyer cannot terminate due to a mortgage contingency. So I've had people in the past try to send a termination and reference that clause or reference that paragraph in the contract. And what that can do is it can potentially entitle, I mean, again, you want to talk to your broker and talk, but there are ways to where I know my skill set in representing my client. And knowing that I could potentially say, well, you're trying to terminate on grounds that aren't allowable in the contract. Wouldn't you rather try to see this through and get another opinion? See if you can't get qualified with another lender. Here are some that I could highly recommend, knowing your buyer's position because you came in with X. We'd like to see if we could potentially, so I garner trying to help support this to get it to the end. Or I could be another agent or a listing agent that says, okay, all right, well, then we're going to keep your deposit. So it's all about knowing what you have the power to do, but exercising what would be in the best interest of your client, and then conveying it in a way that it's trying to get it a win-win with the buyer's agent. You might not know, because obviously if they send over a termination referencing that email, or sorry, referencing that paragraph, they don't know. So, I find it a really good opportunity to educate, but first understand where their position is. You know, I wanna know why. I wanna know why. And first, and then see if I can't not manipulate, hate that word, but I like to see
No,
how,
but educate.
but
on other
educate,
options.
yeah, on what their options are. Wouldn't it be nice to have a potential opportunity for us to see this to the finish line? Because that's really what we're trying to do. Because the last thing I want to do is say, okay, well, I'm gonna keep your deposit. Okay, seller, now we're putting your house back on the market. What does that look like? You know, there are some, not some consequences, but there are some things that could be perceived as negative to put a house back on the market. Now we've lost market time. Now we've So again, you have to kind of, with the art of negotiation, I'm sorry, I'm talking lost, shoot, okay, okay. Is that helpful? Okay, okay,
Can I add to that?
yeah,
Yeah, I thought that was great. I think like if you know your contract, we'll start there, like assuming we know our contract, I think that's, if you don't, that's the place to start. Assuming we all know our contracts and we're super confident, what I heard Amy say is that, and I can't remember what you said about emotion, but what I heard you articulate to the question was that you recognize there is emotion and we want to get to the facts, but what I heard you do is navigate through the emotion. And so she didn't do what I call competitive negotiation or passive negotiation. She did a collaborative form of negotiation, which was saying, I want to end up with a win for my client and a win for your client. And so I'm not going to do competitive negotiation and say, I know the contract, you don't, I'm going to keep your deposit and good luck. Because that's going to be a potential win for my client, maybe.
maybe.
A loss for them and their client for sure. And it's going to put them in a completely defensive and emotional posture, right? And so that's an option, but instead of doing that option, she knew her contract and she decided to do collaborative negotiation and said, hey, let's look at the agreement. And then she articulated what it said, and it sounds like these are the options that we have. And then they can make an educated decision that's in the best interest of their client, which happened to be the best interest of both clients. And so I would say, you know, for me to do like a win-win, we do passive, collaborative, or competitive. And this, I've gotten emails from competitive negotiators before, and it immediately puts me in a defensive posture, and like, I'm thinking with my amygdala, and it's fight, flight, or freeze. And if I'm on the phone call with somebody and it's competitive, like, I'm keeping your deposit because this is what the mortgage is, immediately the creative part of my brain is shutting down. And it's probably gonna be a lose for somebody in the equation. Passive is I'm just always saying yes, because I'm more of a people pleaser and I don't want to enter into any transparent conflict. Both of these are really easy ways of negotiating and they don't take a lot of brain power. This way, which you did perfectly, is I always say that, so what was the question was, what strategies do you use to ensure negotiations result in a win-win for both buyers and sellers rather than one party feeling a loss? Is for me, a lot of times it's the quality of question, assuming we know our contracts. So no contracts first, so we know our options, and then the quality of our questions to the other party. If I can do a needs analysis and learn what the agent thinks the options are and what they know and don't know, as opposed to just prescribing my thoughts and telling them what to do, and what's important to their client, I can gather information through quality questions. And then I can start to articulate some options that probably make sense for both parties to get to the finish line. And I know so many people in here agree with the idea. I've heard Maggie say it a lot. If I'm winning and my client's winning and the other party's client's losing, that ultimately at the settlement table, pre-settlement walkthrough, maybe something in the inspection negotiation, the other person, if they feel taken advantage of and a little resentful, they're gonna want my client to lose. And so our goal as collaborative negotiators, even when we face a competitive negotiation, is to attempt to make sure their client and them and our client and us are winning and everybody's smiling at the end of the day. Because if that's the case, we've done our job really, really well. And for me, that comes through keeping an eye on that middle option and going to the quality of questions so that you can then educate and help everybody make the best option so that we create win-wins. Does that make sense?
That's perfect.
Cool.
And I heard you say part of our core focus says that we provide a collaborative community that supports strong families and businesses. And it's not always just masterminding, right? It's collaborative negotiating.
Yeah.
There's other ways that you can be collaborative, and
Yeah.
it's not just KW to KW agent. We're a collaborative community with KW to Remax and KW to Coldwell Banker.
For sure.
That's who we are.
I mean, who has really strong relationships with other agents? Okay, why aren't we nurturing those? You know, like, I think some of the power in our businesses is the relationships we have with other professionals in the business. Because for me, I know when I submit an offer, let's say to Dave, or let's say to someone from another brokerage, and I've worked with them and I've successfully done this with them in the past, the collaborative piece. Do you think, not that they're supposed to sway, but do you think they're going to speak my offer with much more confidence to their sellers than if I was either one, well, passive, they'd probably be like, yeah, we'll just take advantage of her, right? But competitive, probably not. You know, there's gonna be some hesitation, whether it's voiced or not, but people can pick up on that and that empathetic side of things. When we're working with people that aren't in the business, they're our clients, they're depending on us to get them to the finish line. So I think our relationships with the other agents are just as important as our relationships with clients.
Yes,
Sure.
because if they know that you get it to the finish line every time,
And we have a
then
good
yes,
time
you are
doing
gonna
it.
stand out
Yeah.
among other competitive offers.
Right. 100%. I've had people come to me, not toot my own horn, but I've had other agents come to me and be like, hey, I have this listing coming up. Do you have a buyer for it? I mean, like, not like an investor buyer, an actual buyer, because they were like, they want to work with me. I mean, that just opens up so many more floodgates to give me maybe a little bit of a heads up for my clients. So
I remember when it was probably 10 years ago and I was standing behind an agent at the office, and he's no longer in the business anymore, but he received an email from an agent who was a broker and was really on the competitive side and super threatening in sort of the email and almost looked like a little antagonistic. And I watched this agent's face literally go from his neck to his forehead bright red. And he starts pounding on those keys. And he hit send, like before I could stop. And it literally like started this downward cycle on this transaction that got both clients and it ended in a meeting with multiple, you probably know, you're laughing because you may have a hunch who I'm talking about. But it was such a bad, like tumultuous experience because he received a competitive threatening message instead of taking a moment, maybe picking up the phone and he fired back an email, and that really sent something into a downward spiral that destroyed the transaction and destroyed the relationship between those two people, so that anytime they had an opportunity to do business together, they wouldn't do it because they weren't on speaking terms anymore. And that's like the extreme opposite of what we ever want to do. We want to keep everyone in a collaborative mindset so that we can have satisfied clients and satisfied co-growth relationships.
I love that you just said pick up the phone. I can't tell you how many times Dave said that to me over my career, because you cannot read tone over text messages or email. Like,
Yeah.
And feeding off of that, like, have you ever read a text because you were in a bad mood, as if they were in a bad mood, and then you realize they were actually being nice as pie, and it was just your attitude?
Yeah.
That was
For sure.
We've all had that, and I'm laughing because usually transactional issues, they go through Scott, right? He's the broker, that's how it should go. But Scott pulls me in to help dampen the flames when agents start to get emotional instead of factual. And when those emotions get high, you know, and I've seen it as well, where the transaction is falling apart. Not because there's not solutions, but because emotions are getting in the way of those solutions. So it's incredible how being collaborative can be so important. Because stories are always more helpful, can you share an example of a challenging negotiation where you were able to achieve a positive outcome for all parties involved? And if you could specify what type of specific techniques you use to maintain that kind of collaborative atmosphere, especially when we know emotions get involved.
So mine was almost that story, a little different ending. But it was a relationship with another agent. It really had nothing to do with the transaction. This agent on the other side, is a bully. And he doesn't have a real high opinion of women. And that was very apparent throughout the process. Whatever, we're moving on with the transaction. I could, whatever, it's right. But when he went after my TC and was very disparaging to her,
Mama bear came out.
I was like, wow. So I probably got a little red. But I
Reasonably so.
wrote an email and then I stopped and I didn't send it and I waited a few hours. And I went back and reread the email and took the emotion out, waited a little longer, read it one more time. And I made sure that I was just being very factual. I did call him out on his behavior. It was unprofessional and it wasn't needed. And what she had asked for was very, it was the right thing, she was just doing her job.
Yeah.
And he, whatever, sent the email, never expecting that I would get any response from this guy because he had already shown his colors, right? And lo and behold, 2 days later, I get a text from my TC and it's these googly eyes going across, and I'm like, well, what just happened? She goes, read your email. And he sent us an apology. He recognized that his behavior was not so cool. And so the rest of the transaction really went very smoothly. He submitted his paperwork, as needed but it was, yeah. I got
That's a
little-
great story because the temptation was to attack
Oh, I was ready.
every ounce of it. And you wonder what would have happened if you would have attacked?
Exactly what
And-
happened with the example that you gave.
And how much
It just would've-
harder, yeah.
And it just would have been ugly and.
Yeah.
ugh.
So you took the higher road and de-escalated it, but you didn't hide from it.
Mm-mm. No,
You
Call
didn't,
them out.
you didn't like aggressively threaten, but you didn't roll over and hide from it.
Right.
You were transparent, probably kind but firm and professional and clear, and you're not, this isn't acceptable and good for you.
And there's so much strength in that pause. Like you took a
Yeah.
pause and it takes a
yeah,
lot of strength to say, I need to step back before I hit that
I
send
love
button.
this.
one thing I have learned in this business is your reputation is everything. And somebody was mentioning in the last group that was in here the last hour. To look forward, to always think of your clients, put your clients' needs first. And I always, to tag along with that, always think like far down the road. What, is it worth $5,000 today, to be sly or do whatever and get this transaction or, to get your $5,000 commission? Or is it worth stepping back and saying, you know what, this isn't in my client's best interest. We're gonna pass on this one and think long-term, where you do get them in the right transaction and it goes smoothly and they're happy with you. And now they're referring you to people. You gotta think long-term.
It's good. You have a story?
Any other stories?
I've had a couple with other agents, mostly other agents, but I had one who was a new construction. And he was running he was representing the builder in this really big development. And I had worked for a significantly long time for my buyer client. And we finally got her under contract and with a new build. And, my commission was, and as I do with all of my clients as a buyer client or buyer agent, I explained the commission and I, was garnering a 3% commission. Buyer, builder was paying 2.5. So, we had negotiated some concessions and stuff like that from the seller. So, that's a totally separate and really none of a listing agent's concern, just as his listing contract is none of mine. So he voiced his opinion and felt that it was very wrong, and he included everybody, title, lender, everybody on this email. How dare I collect an additional commission from my client? And I'm not a confrontational person. I want to just love on people and like give them hugs and let's have a good time. And so I very eloquently spoke to the contract and spoke to him, and I included everyone just as he included everyone in his wonderful email. And I basically said that same thing. I said, you don't know the history of my client, and it's my client. And nor do I care what your listing contract says. I said they are separate concerns. So I wrote it really much more eloquently than I'm speaking to, but that was a really pivotal moment in my career that I felt like I really got a hold of that collaboration piece. And I wasn't competitive, I wasn't passive, but I was eloquent, I was assertive and eloquently stating facts in a kind way. And I got an email from every single person on that email chain except for the listing agent, commenting me and saying, or complimenting me, saying, oh my gosh, you were probably one of the first people that stood up to him.
Wow.
And wow, just wow. So I think it's an art. Collaboration is an art. I think what it starts with is empathy. And I think once you can recognize and tell stories too, the emotions that they're feeling and identify them with a process, it almost de-escalates things. So like when I'm working, I'm probably going into another question.
No, that's beautiful. I like that.
Okay. So I like to be very clear about when I'm working with clients, the process of what this looks like. And I almost always appoint an analogy to what we do with our clients. And one of the analogies that I really like to do is like, I'm your pilot and we're gonna take off. And my goal is to land you in a safe spot where you wanna be, right? Doesn't mean that when we take off, we might be a little hairy, we might hit some turbulence, but these are the anticipated areas in which we might hit some turbulence, right? But my goal is to safely land you. So you have to trust in me. And I do that throughout the process. So if we have an inspection contingency and we go through inspections and we're talking about inspections, my job is not to talk to a buyer and tell them exactly what they should do and why. It's not my job. My job is to maybe be informed about what the lender might require them to do or what an appraisal might require them to do. So that there's little red flags that say we might run into this hurdle or this turbulence down here. But I'm not supposed to tell Bob and Sue that the wobbly doorknob is a problem, right? They're going to come to me with a certain set of experiences, a certain set of network of people that they might have a plumber in the family, they might have a roofer in the family, they might have all of these different resources that they can pull upon that make that issue not so big. And they're like, hey, you know what? I'm getting a great deal in the house. So again, what I like to do is I like to take them and I like to hug on them, love on them, and then get them to where they need to be. But I'm not going to tell them how do I say this? I'm
I'm going to help carry them to where they need to be. I'm not gonna tell them what to do. Oh my gosh, I had a connection here. ADHD. It's covered. Wait a minute, for a second, yeah, I missed one. So when I get into those positions where I'm like, okay, all right, hold on. All right, we've got this inspection contingency and it's a freaking mess, right? And I'm thinking in my head, oh my God. So, oh, Dave will know this. So I sent like what, like a 4-page reply to inspections, like no lie, like, oh my gosh. And, but I'm like, I can't tell you what, you know, what's important to you. I can walk you through what you think might be important to you and what that could mean down the road. But I like to use analogies as much as I possibly can, so I can bring it into a space that they understand. Most people don't understand real estate and how it processes through and all the intricacies behind that. And they don't necessarily need to know that. They need to know what consequences they can have for their actions, right? And how I can safely land them. But I'm not here to tell them exactly what to do and how to think. If I can bring it into their world and make it meaningful, for example, like, oh, remember that time you were in high school and it felt this way, or, you know, in a certain example in their life, they're going through a process for something. And then they get to the point where it becomes relevant to them.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? Yeah, okay.
So what I hear you saying is, you said it before, is you use empathy, so you really are seeking to understand where they're coming from and that emotion that they're in. And once they feel understood and that emotion is drawn down, instead of telling them what to do or how to do it, you're giving them the options and you're educating them so they can make the best decision for themselves.
Such, yes, there was.
You got it, that was.
There was.
Much-
Yeah, yeah, no, good summary, yeah.
Thanks, thanks. Drew's telling me I have to tell a story. I haven't met with a client in years and I was struggling with this question. You had asked, what's a circumstance where you were in a contentious negotiation and, you know, how did you navigate it? And in 20 years, I've probably had hundreds of them and they all just, the good news is Josh told me today, like, we all can, it's good that you don't really remember them because that means they're probably not as big as we think they are when we're going through them. Because it's been 7 years since I've met with a client and I know I've had hundreds of sleepless nights around contentious negotiations. And the fact that I took 10 minutes for it and I was like, I can't point one out is really good news for us because they're not that big of a deal. Like, we're not delivering a beating heart, as we say in our office a lot of times. We're not doing surgery. Like, this is not that big of a deal. And that's really good news. But Drew said, I remember one. She said, I remember one. And she said it was a big, she reminded me that it was one of your biggest learning experiences in your career. And so I think, correct me if I'm getting this wrong. She reminded me there was this guy is about my age and his dad had passed away. And his mom lived in Carlisle and she was a widow. And like, it was within the first year of death. And so she's in a very lonely spot. And this guy who is, I knew him from high school, he is like the type of person who's all over it. Like, he called me every morning at 7:30 to ask what we were doing for his mom's property. And my strategy with him was to call him at 7:29. So I would out-call him. And like, that was the only way to be more proactive than reactive with him for a little bit until I earned his trust and he actually could trust that I was doing a good job for him. And so he was just all over it. And it was really on behalf of his mom, who he was probably worried about. And they were so proud of his house. It was well maintained. It was built in the 80s, but it was just impeccable. And we listed it for sale and they talked, he was so proud. He would talk about, you know, the windows and how well maintained everything was and the hardwood floors and all stuff. And of course, when the reply to inspection came back, and I had set expectations, and we do 88 types of turbulence, just like Amy said. And it came back and the buyer, among a lot of other things, wanted all of these charming, not even old, it was an 80s house, double pane, very good condition windows replaced, all of them in the whole house. And I knew because of how his mentality was that he was going to flip out. And And he did.
I was waiting for this heroic moment, like, and I stopped it.
No. He absolutely, and I set it up, you know, we do the double, I did like what I call the double call, so I do the plant the seed call when I know they're gonna flip out. Be like, hey, as I reminded you, you know, about the inspections, a lot of times they're pretty lengthy and that's part of the process. And you might get a buyer who asks for 12 or 15 things and it's gonna feel heavy and that's part of the process. Yeah, whatever. Then he gets it, boom, it's like rocket ship. And a couple things that I don't know that I did at the time, but I think I had naturally come to do these things. And the first is seek to understand before being understood. And so one thing that when someone is extremely emotional, if we bypass that completely and act like it doesn't exist and just go to facts, it's not gonna go well. Because a human's biggest need is to feel understood and accepted. And when you're in a place where you had an expectation of something happening, and then the reality is very different. And there's a gap between what happened and what your expectation was and the reality, there's a gap there. Generally, you're gonna fill that with a narrative, like this person's out to get me, my real estate agent is too, he's in on it, and I don't trust any of them. And my mom's a widow and she's being taken advantage of. I had an expectation, reality didn't fit expectation, there's a gap. And they're gonna fill it with a narrative, whether that's true or not. And that narrative comes from their own experiences, which are out of our control. And his experience was that his dad died a year before and his mom's a widow and they were proud of those windows and the buyers like asking for $10,000, you know, worth of windows. And so knowing that, if I met his extreme emotion with just, hey, let's just talk about the facts, I'm acting like that doesn't exist. And so what Drew said that I did was that, but you want to just tell this part? What did I said to
You were
you,
mad with him.
yeah, so I met him in the emotion and I knew that he was upset. And I think I do this a lot and I think it's really helpful to me even more than the other person. And that is, my inclination was just not to have a conversation and fix it. And instead, what I did and what I do a lot with my wife, and it's very helpful for me in our relationship and with clients, is I thought to myself, man, if my dad, and I told him this, I said, Nick, I was thinking about this, if my dad died last year and my mom, Joy, you know my mom, I remember telling him this, and she was by herself. And she had taken care of her house. And then a friend of mine, you know, was helping me through this. And somebody came and just was like, you're replacing all your windows, 10 grand. I would freak out. And I would be pissed. And like it's no surprise that you are, I would be too. And I actually would be. And he needed to hear, like, that wasn't an act that I was doing, like. And once he felt understood, like he felt like I actually understood his emotion because I sat with him in it for a second. He stopped filling that narrative with, I don't trust Dave. And started filling that with, well, he gets it. Like he would feel the same way and I'm not alone, like freaking out like this. And that was really helpful in that situation for us to find common ground. Then the next thing to your point was once I seek to understand, then I can try to be understood. And so now I can go to, you know, option one is we can just do nothing, go tell them to jump in a lake. And then,
Those are the words.
yeah, just tell them to jump in a lake and move on. We'll list the house. So I'm very unattached to the outcome. I'm not trying to persuade him. That's just option one. If I try to persuade him, he'll
There's
get
another
defensive.
narrative going
There's
on,
another
yeah.
narrative. Why is he trying to persuade me? So I just sat with him in emotion. And so it's like, you know, I think I'm good with any one of these options, genuinely am. Let's just go over what they are. So one is just tell them to take a hike and that's okay. And we'll put it back on the market. And maybe we'll get another buyer in a couple weeks to pay the same price. Maybe we won't. I wouldn't be doing my job if I told you we could be taking another haircut. Option two is we could do everything, in which case your mom will come down on her price 10 grand and like, that doesn't feel great, but you could do that and lock this up for her. I don't think I'd recommend that. Or option three is it's gonna take a little more work for me to do, but I'm happy to spend the time to go get 2 or 3 quotes for the windows just to see what they are. So we can sit on it and see if we're talking about a $5,000 problem, a $3,000 problem, a $15,000 problem. And we can decide if we want to go back and throw them a couple $1,000s to see if they bite. And if not, we can go with option one again. And he sat on it, he chose option two. We got a couple,
Great.
option three, and we got a couple quotes. And he ended up realizing that if we put it back in the market, his mom would be stuck there for longer and we might get a lower price. And he gave a concession of $3,000 or $4,000 and we got to the finish line. But I think at that moment, we can react and get defensive or try and fix. And there's value in the pause.
And the validation.
And the validation, and
Feelings.
and try and make sure they feel understood.
And I also love that you always teach this, that you have to remain unattached to the outcome.
Yeah.
So when you gave him his 3 options, this doesn't affect me much.
I would say, I don't have a big horse in the race.
Right.
Like, if you and your mom do, you're either gonna be sitting in this house for a long time or taking a $15,000 haircut. Like, those are all big things. For me, it's not really gonna affect my life at all. So I'm very unattached to the outcome. I'm just here to give you the 3 options as I see them and help you navigate the best decision for you and your mom. But if you are attached to the outcome, what happens?
Oh,
Start to persuade,
yeah.
and they sense that, and you start to lose trust.
Yep.
I love that great example. Maggie, anything to add?
No.
No? Okay. Your story, I think all 3 of your stories were really great at talking about how to de-escalate the tension. With that being said, what question did I not ask that I should have asked when it comes time to the art of negotiating?
Sometimes what helps me, because I'm a very big, like, not analogy, but I like to, I learn by like maybe making it a song or like doing a dance to it. Like I memorize things, like it's, you just put something to it and then it becomes catchy and then you remember it. So when I get into, sometimes I call them like little triggers, but like when I notice that I'm in a difficult negotiation, or I'm like up against another agent and we're like, or a client who's just like, it's the right word, like a grumpy old man. Let's just say, okay, anybody here a server or was a server? Okay, right? All right. So I used to always make it a game where if I had like a really grumpy client, I would go up to them and like my goal was to get them to like smile by the end of like, smile, right? And it was, I don't know. So part of me, when I get in those situations, it's almost like a challenge to me to get them to like just get to that stage. Like I'm gonna get them out of competitive and get them into collaborative. And it's almost, it's a trigger for me. So some of those tools, when you can step back and recognize first where that other client or agent is, and then make the goal to be collaborative, and then find the tools to get you there. And then bringing it back to the contract and delivering it in a manner that is authentic, real, and engaging. Like I have not really met an agent that I haven't been able to really get to that point. And if I do feel like there's someone that I can't, then I'm just like, okay, I accept it. I'm like, all right, defeat, fine, okay, all right, let's just get to the finish line, all right? But I don't know, for me, it's like hitting those, being able to recognize who you're dealing with, and then being able to say, okay, what are my next steps to get us to that collaboration? I love that.
I think, Dave, 2 principles that you taught, if you could talk about, one is a little around process. In like, if we think about Henry's Guide to Going to Bed.
Mhm. Yep.
We could talk about process, and then you touched on it there, that pre-negotiation
Mhm.
message in anchoring really well. I
Mhm.
think those principles are super important to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, I can share about that. So my son, doesn't like to go to bed. Who has kids? Raise your hand. Is it easy to get them to bed? Really? No. Yeah, I knew. But my wife drew like this, had this thing laminated where it shows like a process, like at 8 o'clock, we go get PJs on, and it shows like a picture of somebody getting PJs on. And then it's like brush teeth, and then it shows a picture, and then it's read, and it shows a picture, and then it's sleep. And it is amazing. When we actually showed him the steps of the process, how it became very real and how much more likely he was to be like, he's more compliant about what's next when he knew there was an order to it, and that became normalized. And I think we're all looking for leadership in what's next. So one of the things I often talk about is these words, fear, anxiety. There's a couple that go along with them, but we won't go into guilt and shame. We'll focus on those. How many of you have felt in a real estate negotiation or right before you call the client with a bad news, a little bit of anxiety? Okay, yeah, right. Whenever there is fear and anxiety, it's generally because we are uncertain about an outcome. That's where it comes from. We're uncertain about something in the future, and we're attached to a positive outcome, and we're uncertain if it's going to come to fruition or not. And so there's a lot of emotion and stuff that comes, and obstacles that come up that don't need to come up when people, including ourselves, are sitting in fear and anxiety because we're uncertain about a future thing that we are tied to. So when I say be unattached to the outcome, anytime I hear a voice of fear or anxiety, I listen to that and I always say, what lie am I believing about a future outcome I'm holding on to? Because there's always something there. And it's like, I want this to go a certain way, and I'm tied to making that happen, and I'm fearful that it's not. And a lot of times I can de-escalate my own anxiety just by becoming unattached to that. I'm like neutral on it, going both ways. That's just a short digression on what Drew said, but the point of the process is that we all develop fear and anxiety, including our customers, about what's going to happen in the future. And it's because they're uncertain about whether they will get taken advantage of in the home price, what they'll get. They're uncertain what the neighbors will think. They're uncertain if the house will sit so long, and they'll feel embarrassed that it's sitting so long. And all of their anxiety and fear they're no different than us, is because they're uncertain about some future imperative that they're tied to, that they want to happen, and they're fearful that it won't. And so one thing that's really, really helpful to solve this for people, because ultimately, if they do have a problem, it's going to be this expectation reality. They had an expectation of this going well. The reality is that it's not. And so their deepest fears and anxieties happened. And now they're going to fill that with a narrative like, I don't trust you, or you took advantage of me. So how do we resolve fear and anxiety that our clients have about the future that they're tied to when we can't control the reality? It's out of our control. I know what their expectation is most of the time. We can't control the reality. They want a certain thing to happen, and they're having fear and anxiety for the process. Well, the answer is define the process. So if we can have a page when we meet with our clients that explains right up front, we tell them what's going to happen up front. And one of the things that we do is we have 88 types of turbulence, a great analogy. And we say, hey, first step in the process is we're going to meet together and do the following things. I'm going to look at the home. Second step of the process is we're going to agree on price and fee structure and your net proceeds. Third step is we're going to put the home on the market, and some turbulence might happen there. Here are some things you might want to expect. The MLS is probably going to be wrong. Probably not going to be thrilled about the write-up, and a couple pictures aren't going to be the best, and we're going to have to redo them. We call that the rough draft phase. That's completely normal, right? I know there's going to be turbulence there for them. I know they have an expectation, and the reality is going to be different. They're going to fill it with the narrative. And I'm explaining that that's part of the process. It's the third step. It's called the rough draft period, right? So we're planting that seed. And then the next step is you're gonna have some showings, and there's a lot of turbulence in showings. You're gonna want feedback quicker than I can get it because the agent's too busy and they're not gonna get it after I've heard 3 times. The lockbox is gonna be left open, the key's gonna be inside the house, the storm door is gonna be left open, and the attic light's gonna be left on. And it's all a big problem because you're gonna be paying higher electric bills and you're wondering why that buyer's taking advantage of you. And that's just a pain in the butt, and I wish I could address it, but it's part of the process. It's the 4th step. It's called the showing part of the process. And then the reply to inspection is gonna come back, and that's really gonna be painful. So a lot of times this home inspector is just gonna destroy our property that we're super proud of. And that's, we have an expectation that our property's perfect, and then this home inspector's paid a fee and feels like we're taking advantage of. So we outline the 8 to 10 steps in a couple of pieces of turbulence through the process so that we can set those expectations and we pull their expectations back to reality. So that when those things do happen, there's no gap between reality and equity. We close the gap. And then we don't have to start to address the emotion like we talked before and sort of rewrite things.
Well, I'm sure then you can also point back to, hey, remember when we had that conversation? Then it starts to come back to them, like, oh, yeah,
For sure.
Josh reminded me that this was gonna happen.
Yeah, but the light's gonna be left on in the attic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that what some of the stuff you were talking about?
But I think the other one too is just, I think about when you have to deliver any kind of news, I'm never going to pick up the call and say, hey, so buyer submitted their reply to inspection, there's 13 items.
Yeah.
They're never gonna,
It's gonna cost you $13,000.
I'm gonna start that process probably 24 to 36 hours in advance.
And I'm gonna do multiple calls on that.
Mhm.
So if I know even though I've discussed all this stuff and I've prepped them for that, then when it actually happens, I'm not, like Drew said, I'm not going to call the client and say, I got a reply inspection and it's this long, this much money. I'm gonna say, hey, the reply, like even when it's in process, I'm gonna remind them, hey, we'll probably get the reply inspection back soon. As a reminder, that initial talk, these things are pretty long and it's very normal for them to be 15, 20 pages long. It's gonna be a whole red section that's gonna heat us up a little bit. It heats me up too. That's part of the process. And, if they do ask, if I'm sensing that the buyer's agent's gonna ask for a lot, they do ask for a lot, we'll go back to our options and we're always gonna have the same 3 options. And I'll touch on those 3 options. And so I'll start to plant that seed and anchor the possibility that, and then when it comes in and I see it, I might say, hey, I'll ping them, hey, I saw that hit my inbox. It does look like there's quite a few things on there. I just gotta digest it. I'll be back in touch here in the next few hours. By this evening, we'll go over it together. So I'm gonna hit them quite a few items. So I'm re-anchoring that. And then by the time I call them with quite a few items, it's the 4th time they've heard it, not the 1st. And so they've had time to sit in that emotion as opposed to erupt on me. And that's much harder to manage that emotion when they erupt on me than when I've anchored it over a course of a couple calls.
Could you restate those 3 options again?
So most of the time, like with the windows for my friend, it's gonna be, hey, option 1 is we can just go tell them to jump in a lake, right? And we can put the house on back on the market. The benefit of that is that you don't have to, navigate through this. And if you feel offended, we can move on. The negative of that is that we had a buyer and it keeps coming back. We had a buyer, stay put. And if we lose them, we can't guarantee that we're gonna get the same offer from another buyer. Option 2 is that we can agree to everything that they want. And the benefit of that is if you're after peace of mind and not financial potential, then you can lock this up and you can move on with your life. But the negative of the consequence of that decision is that we may come down financially more than you would like to. Option 3, which requires more work for me. This one always requires the most work. I don't get paid any more to do it. But I'm happy to do it for you is go get a couple quotes so we can clarify exactly what they're asking for and put a number to it. And then you and I can sit down shoulder to shoulder and decide what of that we think is reasonable to participate in, because the next buyer, if we put it back on the market, is probably going to ask for those things as well. And what of those things might the average buyer not ask for? And therefore we might discern them as unreasonable. And then we can make a counter proposal and see what they say.
Perfect, thank you.
And I feel that to capitalize on what they said, I feel like that your flight plan,
Yeah.
basically when you're talking to a listing or a seller at the beginning, is very helpful because when I do that with my clients, it helps further define what they're capable of in the moment where turbulence happens. Are they grabbing the parachute and jumping? Are they hyperventilating? Are they like, I'm cool, act of the Xanax, I'm good. So like, what it helps me do as a listing agent is if I understand we're gonna get to inspections and I have these conversations before they happen. When we get to inspections and they say, well, Amy, I don't have any money. Or Amy, I'm 80 years old. I don't have the resources to do anything. Like I don't. It sets me up to be able to give that expectation to the buyer's agent that's coming in and say, look, this is how we are best able to meet whatever we're gonna potentially be up against. They don't have the capacity to do repairs. They don't have the capacity, or, if it's like $5,000, there's nothing left in the pot after we're all said and done. There's no equity. Those discussions, if they're had up front, are going to lessen the emotional toll of when it does happen and give the buyer's agent a very clear understanding of how they can then present it so that your client will most likely be able to accept. So I think that that flight plan is really key to identify, but then also to almost set the stage for how we would then address those things.
It's a good point, Amy, of like really understanding your client's fears and concerns
Correct.
and motivation in the way that they understand
And
it.
it makes you look really good
Yeah.
too,
Well,
because.
it also helps you to be able to see that and feel that empathy.
Correct. Yeah.
You know?
And it says, I got you, boo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I do want to go back to, make sure that nobody missed is not only do you explain it, but it sounds like, because I was on the team, so I kind of know, right? That you had it in writing and a visual. And people tend to trust things they see in writing over what you just tell them. So coupling explaining the process and having the dialogue with a diagram or a step-by-step process or the 80
types of turbulence.
80 types of turbulence, that helps your clients absorb that information more because we can't remember everything that we're told.
Yeah.
So that's a key that I just want to point out is having the conversation is step one, but step two is making sure you have a visual when you go to those buyer and seller appointments on what to expect to help educate them along the way. Like Henry, right?
Yeah.
He saw the pictures. As humans, we all learn differently.
So the beginning of that story was the first night Dave didn't use the pictures.
I did not. Oh, well, she did. She put it together for me because she went away.
Yeah.
And she's like, I think you need, my wife did, I think you need pictures to help our son. And then it was like, and I didn't use it, and it was like total circus.
really more for you.
It probably.
Yeah.
I was leaving that out, but you brought it up.
It was amazing, but the first night was
Yeah.
like chaos, and we got pictures of like underwear on the kid's head when he was supposed to be in bed,
Yeah.
like really bad, and then the next night, you followed the process,
And it worked.
and it worked.
I love that. Any other questions for our panelists? And I would also love if you used your 10-5-1-1 or if you took notes, what is the one thing you're going to implement in the next 24 hours after both of today's sessions? Anybody want to share with you?
So I was just wondering if there was any particular books or references that kind of helped you along your journey.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey.
Maybe you should particular about negotiation.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Yeah, there's no greater tool in negotiation than empathy.
No, yeah, empathy and understanding the personality of who you're dealing with, both your client and the agent on the other side.
The one habit that he talks about, seek to understand before being understood. If you have, just read that chapter 10 times and you'll be a master negotiator
Isn't how-
and a master just relationship person. because it's such a powerful
How to
tool.
win friends.
What'd you say?
How to win friends and influence people.
There's another one, yeah, Dale Carnegie.
Following up on that, can I ask this? Is that okay?
Oh, please do.
So let's say you have this perspective and this attitude, and you run into somebody who's competitive and just, no matter what you do, they stay in that competitive mindset.
Yeah, so I think there's two types of competitive people. One is a hostile person. And one is just a very competitive person. A couple things are really helpful. I'll address the very competitive person first. For a very competitive person, I've generally found them overly competitive over email. And if they are, I will show up at their office and talk to them in person, and you would be blown away how much their demeanor changes. When we're sitting person to person, they're not hiding behind email. The conversation is very, very different. I've never had that not work, except if it's a hostile person. And Drew will tell you, before she was running our team, when I was running our team and she was in production, there was a hostile person. And he was
He was threatening me, he was recording me on camera.
it was a different level. It wasn't competitive. And we were in sort of negotiations and I fired. Like, I'm very
So he was
unattached.
the client.
He was fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm very unattached to the outcome. And if there's an agent who's hostile, I'm gonna go talk to them. I'm gonna go to their office and talk to their broker. I'm gonna ask for a meeting with them and their broker and me, the three of us,
And I think,
in person.
And you can call, if an agent from another brokerage is hostile like that, you can call our broker.
For
And
sure.
Scott will be, he is phenomenal. I mean, luckily these don't happen too often, but he will happily walk you through that, talk to the other broker, talk to the other agent. Sometimes when they hear from another voice,
Mhm.
just outside of the transaction, they will,
whose fuse is longer.
Hostility if you feel unsafe, eject yourself from the situation and let somebody else take over.
Yeah.
And we've had that happen. If the client's hostile, I'll fire them. And if they're just competitive, I like to see them in person. Like email's the worst. Phone call is the next, and in person's the best with a highly competitive person.
and with that, I've had one experience with an agent in particular where now we're like friends.
Yeah.
But in the transaction, it felt super rocky and I just couldn't put my finger on it.
Mhm.
And here, this agent was just extremely direct in her communication. She didn't mean anything by it. I finally picked up the phone and I was like, hey, can we just talk about this? Am I too emotional? Like, am I reading this wrong? And what it came down to is she didn't even realize, like, her intention was never to be rude. But then when I pointed out a very particular email and she reread that email, she was like, wow, like, now that you're pointing this out to me, I realize that if I was in your seat,
Yeah.
that this could be taken rude. And now we're great.
Yeah,
But it's
and
like just pointing it out and having a conversation with them.
yeah, you asked, that goes back to quality of the question. So like, I wouldn't schedule a meeting with that competitive person and go and like, I'm gonna like confront them and be like, what's wrong with you? Not at all. Like, I'm like, just like you, I'm like, hey, I'm by your office. Can I stop in and chat with you? And then I'm gonna chat with them and catch up. And hey, about the transaction, I'm just gonna be honest. And I always talk about saying, let's just talk about the elephant in the room. So the elephant in my room is I'm feeling anxiety about a future outcome that I'm tied to, and I'm asking myself, where's that coming from? There's a pretty good chance I have an expectation reality gap and I'm writing a narrative. And so I'm gonna attempt to fill that with truth just by being collaborative, not passive, not competitive, and asking them a few questions. Like, hey, I'm feeling a little weird. It might not be you at all. It might be my issue. I don't want to make it your issue, but if it's my issue. I was reading some of these emails and I'm like receiving them in a weird way and I just don't want to get down that road. Is there anything that I'm not doing right or well that I can do better to help maintain a really collaborative relationship and make sure this gets to the finish line? You're smiling, I'm smiling, and our clients are. If you address people like that, it's very, unless they're hostile, it's very hard for somebody who's competitive to like go more hostile when you're just kind and firm and transparent and candid.
And you're making it about you.
Yeah.
So in therapy, we call that I statements.
I
So
know,
it's,
yes.
I feel because, and then you give, some facts.
Yeah.
And then you sit back. if you point your finger and say, you're being too direct in your email, and now you're making me feel,
Yeah,
it's I feel because of these facts,
Yeah.
and it helps keep their guard down, you don't go into defense mode right away.
And you can always speak to experience, like, and for me, that is always a very big, like, neutralizing space, like, you don't have to make it about, like, you as a person. You can have it be as my experience in the past with a transaction or something like this, the part of a transaction or what have you, where it evolved like this. I'm not quite sure how, what your thoughts are on that. And really what it does is it just speaks to your experience. It doesn't speak to you as a human. And it kind of alleviates them having to feel like they need to compete with you. They're talking to an experience, again, neutralizing it. Competitive people like to make it about. I've noticed competitive people like to win, right? And sometimes at the expense of other people losing, which we've already talked about, creates at the end of the process, sometimes that fear of being taken advantage of. So I always think that you can talk to your experience. You don't have to talk to yours as like yourself, you're not like, hey, I'm like, you're not needing to be vulnerable as a human, but you can be vulnerable with displaying the experiences you've had.
for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I love that. Well, it is 2:03. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Any last words? Thank you so much. Let's give everybody a round of applause.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for
I don't know.
Yeah.
So I had 4 boxes now I'm done.
All right, y'all. See you. How's it all doing?
Oh my God.
Fast.
Are you in test? Yeah.
That's right, I'll follow up.
Yeah.